Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I believe there's been a couple of occasions when I've mentioned that Debbie, Zach, Chris, and I were victims of an arsonist who threw a Molotov cocktail at our house while we were sleeping. Now, if you're hearing this for the first time, everybody was okay. Nobody was hurt, physically anyway. And with the exception of some soot that managed to find its way in the house, the fire damage was contained to the outside of the house. And usually when I talk about the incident, I talk about how God took that evil action and used it for good. Because if it wasn't for that incident, I wouldn't have been invited to speak to inmates, prison inmates, about the impact of crime on its victims. That invitation led me to volunteering and co-facilitating a reentry program at the federal prison in Schuylkill County, which I was able to do for 3 years. But my time in prison ministry is not the only result of what happened on July 16, 2007. I also learned a great deal about our criminal justice system. Maybe more, quite frankly, than I really ever wanted to learn. Because despite our efforts to avoid it, the case went to trial, and I had to testify. The first attorney to represent the perpetrator was the public defender, and the public defender waived the preliminary hearing, sending the case to the Common Pleas Court. When this happened, the assistant district attorney and the police officers involved were fairly confident that a plea agreement could be reached and a trial avoided. Then a private attorney was retained, and he immediately moved to have a hearing on the charges and tried to suppress some of the evidence. Now, I testified at that hearing. The only people at the hearing were the judge, who I knew, the stenographer, who I knew, the two attorneys I both knew, the police officers, and the perpetrator. And Debbie was there as well. I was a little nervous, but I was fairly comfortable with what was going on because I knew everybody in the courtroom. That hearing was in May of 2008, and we went through the entire summer waiting for a decision from the judge. Finally, the week before Labor Day, the judge ordered a trial and denied the effort to suppress the evidence. I think it was Thursday or Friday when the police came to me and told me, and said, the trial starts first thing Tuesday morning, and you're testifying. So Debbie and I get there early on Tuesday morning, and the ADA runs through what he will ask me. I ask him a question or two, and then I go upstairs and sit on a bench outside the courtroom. Debbie and the victim advocate go into the courtroom, and I watch other people enter as well. Now, I'm the third witness to testify after our two neighbors, who were the ones that alerted us to the fire. And the three of us are sitting in the hallway, and sitting there, and sitting there, and sitting there. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the first neighbor is called in to testify, and then the second. And then it's my turn. Now this time it's different. All the same people were sitting there who were at that hearing. But sitting to my left, right over there, were the 14 people of the jury. The press was in the audience, and some other folks I did not know were there as well. And sitting literally right in front of me was the man who had victimized us. In the other courtroom, the witness stand wasn't nearly that close to the defense table. So I sat in a chair, I folded my hands and placed them on the ledge of the witness stand, just like this. Not because I was the proper thing to do, or I thought it was the proper thing to do, but because if I had them there, they wouldn't shake. My stomach was full of butterflies, and I kept reminding myself, just answer the question, be polite, be firm. Just answer the question, be polite, be firm. I knew what the ADA was going to ask me, so I had no problem with those questions. It was the defense attorney's questions I was not sure of, so I kept reminding myself, just answer the question, be polite, be firm. The defense attorney finished his questions and I was excused. I walked back and sat down next to Debbie, and the victim advocate leaned over and said, "Wow, you were really strong." Now, I don't remember exactly what I said to her, but it was clear to me that she did not see all that was going on. So this morning we step away from the resurrection stories and take a look at a text that is very familiar to many. It is a text that has inspired artists since the earliest days of Christianity. The symbol of the Good Shepherd is one of the most ancient signs of our faith. It first appeared in Christian art way back in the 1st century. Back then, its most common form was catacomb art. Early Christians decorated their tombs with the symbols of the Good Shepherd. On their tombs, the symbol reflected their belief that Jesus was carrying them to heaven. So the image might look like something like this, with Jesus with the lamb on his shoulders. The picture on the altar was painted by Warner Salmon and is dated 1943. If it looks familiar, it's because it's a picture that's usually hanging in the office on the divider. This picture of the Good Shepherd came from the 1922 Sunday school material that is in the curio cabinet in the social hall. Now, there's none in this sanctuary, but I suspect many of us have been in churches and sanctuaries where there was a stained glass window depicting Jesus carrying a sheep. Now, while the portrayal of Jesus as the Good Shepherd is comforting and reassuring, if that's all we really get from these 8 verses, we did not see all that was going on. So to see what's going on, we need to go back. Chapter 8 ends with the people so upset with Jesus that they are picking up stones to throw at him. Chapter 9, Jesus heals the man born blind, creating quite a stir with the Pharisees. Now, it was bad enough that he healed the man born blind, but he did it on the Sabbath, doubly stirring up the anger of the Pharisees. Now, chapter 10 opens with Jesus saying, "Very truly I tell you." Now, the you here is plural, and the you Jesus is referring to is the Pharisees. So now think about it for a minute. I had one perpetrator sitting in front of me, and there was a sheriff's deputy and 2 police officers in the courtroom. Jesus is speaking to a group of people who had just wanted to stone him. And he's not exactly speaking words that they took as comfort. I am the Good Shepherd. Now, what's Jesus saying here in those 5 words? I am the Good Shepherd. Jesus is telling them he is God. And he does it twice in 5 words. I am, ego eimi in Greek, is what God said to Moses when Moses said, "Who shall I say sent me?" The Good Shepherd. The psalm for today was the 23rd Psalm, which was our prayer of the people. The Lord is my shepherd. In Ezekiel 34, God says, I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. So after they already wanted to stone him, Jesus goes and tells them that he is God, not once, but twice. The Good Shepherd will lay down his life for his sheep. Notice Jesus doesn't say might or could. Now, the translation that Pat read, it was a little ambiguous the first time, but then the other times, it cleared it up and made it less ambiguous. Jesus doesn't say might or could, like he's saying, this might involve some risk. Jesus is saying it will. I will. He's telling anyone in hearing range what is going to happen to him because Jesus is going to allow it to happen to him. Then he gets a shot in at the Pharisees. The hired hand runs away from the first sign of trouble because the hired hand doesn't care about the sheep. The hired hand Jesus is referring to is the Pharisees. You don't care, he says, about these people. The first sign of trouble, you're going to turn your back on them and run and save your own skin. You won't risk a thing for these folks, but I'm going to lay down my life for them because I am the good shepherd, he says. And Jesus' words here turned out to be correct. See, by the time this gospel was written, the temple had already been destroyed. Scholars tell us that when the Romans were destroying the temple, some of the Pharisees took off to save their own skin. So the first hearers of John's gospel, these words of Jesus are a lived experience. They saw it. And it's interesting how Jesus portrays himself as God, as a shepherd. Now, we have these images of a shepherd that artists have given us, and they've romanticized shepherds. But remember, in Jesus' time, shepherds were outcasts. If they weren't at the bottom of the societal pecking order, they were very close to it. Now, I have to believe that shepherds were strangers to the Pharisees. Shepherds were the other in that society. But that is the image of God Jesus gives us. I wonder what Jesus would say today if he were standing here in our context. What image would Jesus use? I wonder if it would be something like, I am the good migrant worker. Or would it be, I am the good refugee? Or maybe it would be good, I am the good transgender. Or would he say, I am the good gender non-binary? Who is the other in our society that Jesus would portray himself as today? Now, if we look at this picture on the altar, and Kaylee spotted it, just like my tie, there's a black sheep. My coach back there is telling me to lift it up. Just like my tie, there's a black sheep in this picture. This artist included a black sheep in this picture. Jesus said, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. When we had the press conference after the racist and anti-Semitic graffiti was spray painted on the two businesses in Mount Pocono last fall, one of the pastors stood at the podium and said, if you think everyone in heaven looks like you are in for a rude awakening. Jesus is telling everyone listening that he is there for more than just them. He is there for the other, and the other will be a part of that flock, and it'll be an open-ended flock. Maybe that's why the Hebrew Bible in one verse commands, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But in no fewer than 36 places commands us to love the stranger. According to Barbara Brown Taylor, the Greek word for love of stranger is philoxenia. Take the word apart and you get philo, one of the 4 Greek words for love, and xenia for stranger. The English translation of philoxenia is hospitality. The text we heard this morning ends with Jesus repeating that he will lay down his life of his own accord. John's Jesus is willingly going to the cross. John's Jesus is telling people, this is my decision, I'm doing this, and you are not doing this to me. In those 8 verses, we heard Jesus say he will lay down his life 5 times. So after I testified, the person from the state police lab testified, and then the 2 police officers who worked the case testified. The defense offered no witnesses, and we went home for the day. We came back the next day for the closing arguments and the judge's instructions to the jury. The jurors went to deliberate, and we waited. I think there's still a little groove on the courthouse floor from pacing back and forth. It was over 2 hours when the jury came back with the guilty verdict. Now, someone told me down the road that it took them about 20 minutes to actually come up with the verdict, and the rest of the time was doing all the paperwork they had to do to complete for the court. Our text ended with verse 18, but chapter 10 and Jesus' dialogue with the Pharisees continued. Things didn't go quite as well for Jesus with the Pharisees as they did for me with the jury. And by verse 31, they're ready to stone Jesus again, once again for blasphemy. Clearly, the words that brought comfort and assurance to the disciples and the others following Jesus, and to us today, did not sit well with the religious leaders. I suspect I'm not the only one who has read this text and thought of these images that the artists have created. Images of comfort and reassurance, of Jesus carrying me and caring for me. I suspect I'm not the only one who did not realize the tension in the air when Jesus was speaking these words. I'm probably not the only one to not see the challenges this text presents us. Jesus is presenting himself as God. God who comes to us not as someone in the proper social circles, but as an outsider from a marginalized population. Am I the only one that got so wrapped up in the idea of Jesus carrying me and caring for me that the whole idea of welcoming the stranger, was completely overlooked? Am I the only one whose eyes were opened by this text when I realized all that was going on? Amen. Bless you.